a man who claimed to be God, who claimed to be the only way of salvation, who clearly claimed to be the way of forgiveness of sin, and then controlled the forces of nature, raised the dead, healed the sick, cast out demons, predicted his own death and resurrection, and then raised himself from the dead. And eyewitnesses saw this. Now, if that really happened, and that's really the question here, then Jesus has tremendous credibility in my book. And frankly, I'm going to stick with Jesus Christ instead of with Deepak Chopra on this issue.
Yeah, but what if I showed you similar accounts in the East about other people?
What's going on, everyone? My name is Hosseinzadeh, and in today's exciting video, we're going to be taking a good look at a debate that took place between Christian Apologist Greg Koukl and modern-day guru Deepak Chopra. There's going to be a clash of worldview and ideas and religious beliefs, but I think we're going to learn some powerful things. Watch this.
And you look at what Christianity historically is accepted as being the most accurate depiction of what Jesus said, did, and etc. You would concede that your conception of an impersonal God would contradict that. Is that right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It would.
Okay.
And, I disagree with Mr. Koukl that the four Gospels were, written at the time of Jesus' existence.
When do you think they were written?
Well, according to all scholarly research, anywhere from 60 AD to 100 AD.
Yeah, at 62 AD, the book of Acts was finished. That was the account of the early church, and Paul was in prison at that time. We know when he was in prison. By secular history, it was in 62, okay? The book of Acts was written by Luke after he wrote his gospel. That means the gospel of Luke had to be written in the late 50s. All scholars say the gospel of Luke was not the first gospel, but rather Mark was the first gospel and possibly Matthew. So you have two other accounts written before the end of the second decade after the death of Christ. So by that reckoning, within 15 years, you have writings circulating about the life of Christ from people who experienced the very thing. That's good scholarship, and that's standard scholarship. Are there people out there on the fringes that say differently? Certainly, but that's not sound scholarship. I just gave a very good argument for early dating, and it's sound.
Okay, I read the recent Newsweek issue, which differed quite a lot from your account.
Consider the source. Newsweek and the Jesus Seminar, even those people who are considered very, very radical, even by liberal academic scholars on this issue, they don't draw from the right sources, quite frankly.
Okay. You must draw from the right sources.
No, there is a wide variety of sources to draw from that mainline evangelical and non-evangelical scholarship to draw from, and they didn't do that. I mean, I just know the field.
Do you agree that the King James Bible is like the 18th or 19th iteration since the year 313?
No, you have a misunderstanding about how translations take place. This is my field. The translation goes from the Greek into the English from the original manuscripts, and the original language was Greek. So you have one iteration from what I use now, like a New American Standard or an NIV Bible, and what was written then. One iteration, not 18 iterations. There have been other translations that they don't build upon.
And you really believe that Christ's version of the truth is the only version of the truth?
I think Jesus was right. I think if the Gospels are accurate, and I have every reason to believe that they are in their broad, salient details. And here's a man who claimed to be God, who claimed to be the only way of salvation, who clearly claimed to be the way of forgiveness of sin, and then controlled the forces of nature, raised the dead, healed the sick, cast out demons, predicted his own death and resurrection, and then raised himself from the dead. And eyewitnesses saw this. Now, if that really happened, and that's really the question here, then Jesus has tremendous credibility in my book. And frankly, I'm going to stick with Jesus Christ instead of with Deepak Chopra on this issue.
Yeah, but what if I showed you similar accounts in the East about other people?
Then I'd have to see whether the justification, if you are just as critical of the historical reliability of those documents as you are of the gospel accounts, and to see if those documents have as well attested evidence for their historical reliability as the gospel accounts. So far, I haven't seen that.
Well, I think personally, both East and West versions of God are mostly mythical and not historical.
Does it come down to the issue of truth, Dr. Chopra, that can we or can we not know the truth about God?
I think in a certain state of awareness, when we can experience deep stillness within us, we can get a great taste for it. But I don't think we can, in the relative, ever know the truth unless we are willing to embrace our own uncertainty and take that leap of faith and say, I'll trust the unknown because of what I've experienced. But, my faith doesn't come from a book.
Okay.
Not even mine.
Well, just the idea of truth is diametrically opposed to taking a leap of faith. Listen, Lee, if you can't know what the truth is on things in general, you will not survive 24 hours. Everybody who gets in a car, everybody who takes medicine, everybody who walks out the door has to have some way of assessing what the truth is.
But now, lots of people have religious truth that's so different.
Well, this is the question is whether it's true or not.
To be the only one that's true.
I'm not arguing right now that this one is the only one that's true. What I'm trying to argue is that they can't all be true. And just because you have people who have different conceptions of truth doesn't mean that all conceptions of truth are equal. If people have a different conception of truth, then obviously they could be mistaken.
They're as fervently convinced as you are.
That's right. That's why it doesn't matter how fervent the person is. What matters is the reasons he has for believing what he believes.
Before the break, Dr. Chopra, you were talking about your concept of God, and we got into the Jesus issue and a little bit of clarity between the difference of opinion between you and Mr. Kokol. You had said that you carry around the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus delivered, in which he did some of his teaching, and yet Greg was saying that there are other teachings of Jesus concerning judgment, concerning sin, and so forth, that you don't subscribe to. So how can you kind of pick and choose what you want to take from Jesus and mix it with other people's viewpoints? Doesn't that contradict itself there?
The King James Version of the Bible is about the 19th iteration. If you go look at the history of Christianity, Western Christianity began about 313 AD when King Constantine decided to adopt it for political reasons. There are versions of Christianity that are quite different. St. Paul went west and then others went east. And even amongst Christians, there are a wide variety of ideas about what Christ said or did not say. We have no direct evidence of what he said because the Gospels, even the 4 Gospels, were written long after the death of Christ. And there are other Gospels which we are more familiar with in the East, and we have a tradition of really having reverence for Christ as a messenger of God, but not the only messenger of God. And all I can say is that's the worldview I was brought up with.
Yeah. Well, basically all he said is that there are different points of view with regards to Jesus and other religions, which to me is just quite obvious. The question is, how do we know the right answer about any of these kinds of things? You go back to the primary source documents that give you the information about those people. Dr. Chopra is just mistaken in his assertion that that we don't have any good record of the life of Jesus. Actually, Lee, you've done tremendous work on this yourself. There is tremendous, powerful scholarship that demonstrate that the Gospels were written early and not late, that they represent eyewitness reports, and they give us a reasonably accurate view of what Jesus actually said and what he did. And these are the important situations, these are the important details that I'm talking about here. Because people have differences of opinion about it doesn't mean that nobody can possibly know. He said, Dr. Chopra said earlier, who's to say? Well, the answer is the person with the best reasons gets to say. You look at the writings and you see if somebody's accurately represented them. I could take some of the things that Dr. Chopra has said today and I could isolate them and characterize him as a fundamentalist Christian who believes exactly as I do. If I were to do that, he would consider himself ill-abused, and he'd be right. But we think nothing about doing the same thing with Jesus, isolating those things that fit into our worldview and make Jesus into somebody like us rather than letting him be himself. By the way, Christians do this as well. It seems manifestly clear in any record of what Jesus had to say that Jesus wasn't a Hindu mystic. He didn't believe in cosmic consciousness. He was a Jew. He was a monotheist. He was a Jewish rabbi. He held to the Old Testament and he made some corrections in people's misunderstandings, but his worldview was a Jewish biblical worldview and not a Hindu worldview. And we would be well to read Jesus' statements in light of that if we're going to take him seriously. One of the reasons we quote Jesus, and Dr. Chopra does as well, because Jesus is someone to be contended with. If he is, we should listen to him carefully and be very careful that we get his statements right.
Okay, Dr. Chopra?
What about people who are not Christians? What about them? Are they damned to go to hell forever?
Well, the answer to this is very simple in a broad sense. I mentioned earlier that reality has a way of bruising people who don't take it seriously. Whether I'm right or whether you're right in our respective views, there are consequences to people who get it wrong. If you're right and I get it wrong, I'm going to be hurt by that, Dr. Chopra. If I'm right and you get it wrong and others get it wrong, then they can be hurt by it as well. I'm just simply saying there are consequences. If what Jesus said is right, then there are serious consequences for unbelief because everybody will stand before God and give an account for their life and be properly tried for the crimes that they committed against God. Now, maybe Jesus is wrong. Maybe you're right. But if you're right, I'm going to miss out. There are consequences for getting the truth wrong. And this is why I'm emphasizing we have to be very careful about the truth issue.
See, the difference between you and me is you're certain and I'm not. That's all. And my uncertainty I'm willing to embrace and I'm comfortable with my uncertainty, and you seem to know the truth. So that's our essential difference. And, when I talk to Islamic people, they're very certain about their point of view, and so are the Hindu fundamentalists. And so That's where the problem lies.
Okay, this to me, and I don't at all mean to be unkind, Dr. Chopra, but this sounds like but I don't mean this, but I think that was a disingenuous remark. You must have 8 or 10 titles that have sold hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of copies of books, in which you are telling people what you think the world is like, and you are enjoining them to believe their way. Nobody in his right mind would, you're enjoining them to believe like you, and nobody in their right mind would do that unless they were reasonably convinced their view was correct. If they weren't, then you have no right to tell people that.
I'm not enjoining people to believe in a certain way. I'm just expressing a worldview. That's all.
Yes, but your book is called The Way of Peace, isn't it?
They're endorsed by Christians, by bishops, by people all over the world. And, some people agree with me and a lot don't.
Right, but if they don't agree with you, you probably think they're mistaken.
You can't impose your values on me, and I don't want to impose my values on you. And, when you say I'm being disingenuous, that's not true. Absolutely not true. In fact, I talk about the wisdom of uncertainty in all my books.
My only point about disingenuity in this regard was that you say that you're open and you're not certain, but that seems unusual to say when somebody writes so many books that enjoins and encourages people to embrace his beliefs.
I talk about uncertainty all the time. I talk about an evolving worldview. I talk about the fact that science is discovering that at the heart of creation, there is omniscience, there is omnipresence, there is omnipotence. But I cannot conceptualize that in somebody who's a person who has been squeezed into the volume of a body and comes from a particular ethnic background.
Okay, well, you can't conceptualize that, but since you're uncertain, it might be the case then, because maybe you could be wrong, as you said, that this point of view is the correct view, even though it's hard for you to conceptualize that the things that Jesus said taken as a whole...
But you seem to be very sure that your point of view is correct, aren't you?
I'm pretty confident, but that's because I've looked carefully.
Good luck.
And that's because I've looked carefully.
So are the Islamists, so are the Hindus, so are the Jains, so are the Zoroastrians.
This is precisely why psychological confidence isn't enough. You need more than psychological confidence. You need good reasons to support that. And this is why a lot of work that I've done and Leah's done as well is to give reasons for faith. So we're not taking a jump, a leap of faith. It's not religious wishful thinking, but we are trying to build knowledge based on good rationale.
What an amazing debate that took place. The video actually didn't have much more to it except for about a minute, but that was cut off. It's such an old video, but I think it demonstrates the importance of Christian apologetics. I know Greg Koukl, and I talked to him about this debate that took place many years ago, and he said he was quite surprised by the interaction he had with Deepak Chopra. When you look online, there's actually not very many debates by Greg Koukl. He's an excellent Christian apologist, but I wish he would have gotten into some more debates. I think we would have seen more of this particular side come out of him. What stands out most is the contrast between Western and Eastern ways of thinking. In the West, especially in the Judeo-Christian and Greek traditions, we've learned to think in terms of truth, falsehood, logical consistency. If this is true, then it cannot be this. It's a linear approach. We ask what corresponds to reality. The Eastern thought often takes a more fluid and holistic view. It emphasizes experience, mystery, paradox. The idea that opposing things can be true in some higher sense. My background, for example, I come from both a Hindu background and a Sikh background before I became a Bible-believing Christian. That's India for you. Chopra talks about consciousness being both everything and nothing, or when he blends scientific terms like quantum with spiritual ideas and consciousness. It can sound profound, but it just blurs the line between what's actually true and what simply feels meaningful. And that's where we, as followers of Christ, have to pause. Jesus was born in a part of the world that touches Africa, Asia, and Europe. He grew up in Africa. He grew up also in Israel. He was surrounded by Greek influences, Eastern mysticism, Roman influences, and Jewish tradition. Yet Jesus knew how to win all kinds of people. Jesus once said that many will come from the East and the West and will sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Even in his birth, wise men from the East came to worship him. And in John chapter 12, right before his crucifixion, Greeks from the West came asking to see him. In his own life, he had people from the East and from the West. From the manger to the cross, Jesus drew hearts from every direction, East and West. Why? Because he knew what ultimately men were seeking. Whether people come from mystical traditions that value experience or rational cultures that demand logic, they find their fulfillment in him, because he is the truth for every culture. When we talk about Jesus growing up at the crossroads of culture, we also have to remember that language shapes how we see the world. Jesus lived in a world of multiple languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. Each carried its own way of thinking. Take, for example, Hebrew. It's a language of action, concrete, earthy, and relational. It emphasizes movement and experience. Hebrew isn't describing just mere concepts. Truth is something you live, not just something you know. Greek, on the other hand, is a language of reason and reflection. It defines, analyzes, and seeks clarity and precision. I think that's why the New Testament, written in Greek, could express who Christ truly is. And I think also because Jesus knew where culture was going. When John opens up his gospel saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," he's using the clarity of the Greeks to describe the Hebrew God who acts in history. Jesus is uniting both worlds, the Hebrew God who moves and the Greek logos who reveals. As Paul writes, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of the darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." You see, the Jews sought after light, the Greeks sought after knowledge, and the Romans sought after glory. And yet all of that was revealed in Jesus. Look, at the end of the day, regardless of our culture, where we're born, we have to have a commitment to truth. Truth isn't just a set of ideas or moral principles. Truth is a person. Jesus himself said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." All truth is connected to him, and he is the source of all truth. Truth is objective, but it's also relational. Truth is factual, but it's also transformative. Truth is not just known, it's lived out. Jesus wasn't just speaking to one culture, one kind of thinker. He was reaching out to all people, east and west, inviting them to receive the free gift of life and salvation. He didn't say, "Go find a light." He said, "I am the light of the world." And that's what draws people, east, west, ancient, and modern. Because Jesus doesn't just offer mere spirituality. He offers salvation. He doesn't just awaken consciousness. No, he awakens the soul. He understands all worldviews, and above all, he understands the human heart. And every one of us has an obligation to discover who he is. You know, one day when I was sitting down at a doctor's office, I met a Sikh doctor, and he began asking a little bit about my background, who I was, what I do for a living. And when I told him I was a pastor, he got quite surprised. And he said, "Why?" So I began sharing with him just a little bit about my religious sort of experience of how I came to be a follower of Jesus. And you know what he said? He interrupted me and he said, "You know, at the core of it, all religions are the same. You look at them, they're all the same. They're all describing a path to heaven." He said, at the core of it, it's what you get all across the board. And I paused, and I knew the Spirit gave me wisdom because I said to him, "I noticed you said the word 'it.'" He said, "Yeah?" And I said, "You said at the core of it." And I said, "It's not about an it, but about a who he is, the one who existed before all of this, the creator of the universe." And at that moment, he looked at me and he said, "Can you pray for me?" You see, because even with this man who was jaded with religion and tradition, who grew up surrounded by different kinds of ideas, at the end of the day, he had a longing in his heart for a God who truly knew him, who truly understood what he was going through. A God who is compassionate. A God who is, as the Bible says, eternal. And it says in Ecclesiastes, he has put eternity in our hearts. You see, this man, jaded as he was with religion, knew in his heart that he needed to know who God really was. Hi, my name is S.D.N.Y. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more exciting content.